Welcome to Education Connect by Nova, the podcast that explores innovative teaching methods and success stories, newsworthy updates in education, and current trends in the classroom. Whether you're a veteran educator, an industry thought leader, or a parent navigating the academic landscape for your child, we've got you covered. And hey, we know all about the hectic schedules in academics, so we're all about delivering content that's relevant, concise, and actionable. So hit that subscribe button and let's learn better together. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Education Connect by Nova, the podcast where we learn from experts, innovators, and leaders in the world of education. There's a fine balance between education and engagement. Most teachers know that to teach, you must engage, and that an engaged classroom is the perfect opportunity for learning to take place. However, building a curriculum that finds a perfect symbiosis with these two elements is not always possible. Sometimes teachers must follow a specific rubric to determine what people learn beyond the classroom. Sometimes the material just isn't all that interesting. So teachers can benefit from incorporating core subjects into lessons relevant to the students' lives. And what's more relevant than local or national culture? Today, I'm speaking with Ross, a master curriculum builder. For nearly a decade, Ross has been deeply involved with researchers, educators, curriculum designers, instructional designers to create an effective learning experience. Hi, Ross.
Hey, Erin.
How are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. I appreciate your time today, and I'm looking forward to talking to you more about curriculums.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, in a recent project, Ross, you partnered with UNESCO to build a curriculum for use in South Africa. Can you tell me a little bit more about this project and the learning objectives?
Yeah. Recently here at Nova, we provided a consultancy for UNESCO in Southern Africa, covering about 11 countries in the Southern African region, South Africa included. The primary goal is built around a UNESCO convention from the 1970s that's invested in preserving cultural heritage. This initiative is rooted in that and also some more, let's say, recent initiatives to integrate 21st century pedagogy into schools in Southern Africa. And the project was really a fusion of these two goals: cultural heritage preservation and 21st century pedagogy. So we were working with their regional headquarters to create educational materials that fuse that together and they can serve as a resource for schools and educators across the region to integrate that into their schools and into their curriculum.
What inspired the idea of creating a curriculum tailored to local issues such as water security and agriculture?
So I think both if we were to think about a prerogative to build in 21st century learning and simultaneously build in educational materials that are speaking about cultural heritage, focusing on local issues is a really logical middle point. From the 21st century skills lens, we can see that we want to have content that is interdisciplinary, that is real world. And from a cultural heritage perspective, we want to have materials that can speak to the lives of people and speak to their historical lives, but also their present lives. Cultural heritage classically, let's say, but in a UN context is generally divided into two different branches. One is called tangible cultural heritage and one is called intangible cultural heritage. Tangible being cultural heritage that is material. That could be buildings, that could be artifacts, that could be things that are things that you can touch, the things that you can grab. Intangible, things that you cannot touch. But maybe we can say tangible cultural heritage might be a type of woodworking sculpture that's been made and sits in a village still. The intangible cultural heritage is the method, the way that people in that community will handle that wood and handle those crafts. So this is all to say is that intangible cultural heritage is sometimes also referred to as living heritage. It's still a part of people's lives. It's not an artifact of the past. So if we're interested in connecting to local issues, then that also is a very great intersection with this living culture, this thing that's still alive and still speaking to their place and their context and the communities that are there.
That makes a lot of sense. Some topics, though, can be far removed from a student's life in terms of even the tangible or intangible culture that you're discussing. Some students, perhaps they are too busy with their schooling to really maybe be involved with their local community in such a way.
I think it's good pedagogy. I think students who can relate to the material at hand will more likely have sustained attention and interest in the subject. There might be some reasons why a teacher might want to divorce the content from the student. Maybe because the topic is a little too sensitive and they don't want to emote too much, I don't know, emotional dysregulation, let's say, in a student. Or they're interested in supporting students develop abstract and conceptual thought. Maybe then you don't want to ground that too thoroughly in a local example. But I think even in many of those examples, I could think of, yeah, it's still good to have relevance and tie things in locally. So yeah, it's a pedagogical choice that typically is a good way to go, but it's not necessary in all learning outcomes for all learning outcomes. Excuse me.
And what metrics or assessments are in place to measure the impact of this curriculum, specifically the one that you had developed for Southern Africa? Were there any maybe, let's say, success points you were looking for?
So I would say a lot of the evaluation is actually in the hands of other folks. I know UNESCO's working on that, and I'd have less to say about that. A lot of our work was designing and then working with, let's say, teachers or school leaders and interviews or focus groups to think and talk about integration. A big purpose of this was not to, let's say, implement a curriculum on a systematic scale across 11 countries, but rather to develop teaching and learning resources that can serve as models to help local schools in their own regional context develop their own and modify it into their own context. So for us, focus groups was the primary mode that UNESCO used to collect evaluation and feedback on it.
Can you share any success stories or perhaps even examples of positive outcomes resulting from this specific curriculum?
Yeah, I think so. On one hand, we're trying to support cultural heritage preservation. On the other hand, support 21st century skills development. From a school level, and from even a country level, we're trying to build more capacity of schools and ministries of education or educational organizations that are invested in either or of these categories. So from let's say, more macro level, school level and above, I would say that's the primary impact, improving teachers' school educational capacity to do those things. From a curricular lens, what kind of impact are we trying to make? What's the value of teaching cultural heritage? What's the value of bringing 21st century education into schools for students? From the cultural heritage lens, we are hoping that people can have a better appreciation for their own culture and or have a greater appreciation for the culture of others in their environment, in their broader region. So in that sense, build greater social cohesion. We also, I think there's an inherent value in cultural heritage, helping people just see the human, the cultural, even the aesthetic value of those things. People being connected to their past, grounding themselves in a present moment. The underarching, I think, belief too between cultural heritage and 21st century skills development is that both of these things working together can promote sustainable development in the context that they're operating in. So 21st century skills is a technical term that's also a popular term that's used in a lot of educational literature that talks about ways that kids can learn, or things the kids should be learning, even adults should be learning, to operate in a new type of economy that's emerging in this century. And a lot of that is put in contrast with let's say, more traditional styles of education that emphasizes facts, memorization, route learning. A lot of the 21st century skills, although there's different ways of defining it, are based around critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration, and various other things. And the reason why this is being pushed so hard in so many different environments, including in Southern Africa, is because people believe that this is the way to promote young people's access to better jobs and participate in this new type of economy. So the hope is that this type of curriculum is serving as a model to hold on to both of these things, a new type of pedagogy that can help develop different types of skills in young people and simultaneously help them find connection to cultural heritage of themselves or neighbors as a way of fostering appreciation of self and also building social cohesion with others. And all of these things together are directing toward sustainable development, helping communities and countries thrive in the 21st century.
That's awesome. I love that you brought that up about how, maybe even focusing on local topics could expand a student's mind beyond their local region or area and integrating 21st century skills for better job opportunities. Especially now that the world is changing pretty rapidly well, not that it's now doing that, but it's always been changing rapidly from technology. But I think it's really important now than ever to foster those kinds of skills in students.
Yeah, I agree with you.
One thing that I wanted to kind of tie in as well was because in the curriculum or the case study that you had shared with me about the UNESCO curriculum for Southern Africa was about the impact of dam construction in that local region. Now, this is, of course, related to sustainability on a local level, but applying this kind of, let's say, locally focused education, how could that build a bigger sustainability picture for a student? Let's say maybe someone who's currently learning this curriculum in Southern Africa.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, to think about that example, I think that actually was a somewhat complicated lesson. So I can share my opinion on this. I can't speak for or represent UNESCO, but I can share what I've observed, and at the same time share that UNESCO is one of the important leaders in this work on a national scale, and global scale, really helping build infrastructure in schools and in ministries of culture and many other areas that for people that are interested, this could be a very great resource. So I'll just share, my thoughts and reflections on it, but don't want to pretend like I'll speak for all of their work that they're doing.
Yes, absolutely.
I think a lot of maybe in a similar way to how we started the conversation, the local context for people's lives are most relevant to them, and they're the most interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Things that are really far away are abstract and they seem irrelevant. Not every child believes in the butterfly effect, right? The butterfly flaps here and that affects something in the other side of the world. And even if they do believe it to a degree, the meaning of it is not so clear. It's so abstract, it's hard to get behind in full, especially as a young kid. And in that sense, I think as a teacher, it's harder to implant values. So from an educational lens, yeah, you want kids to be able to see what's happening in their world, in their reality, and not somebody else's reality. Mm-hmm. And when you can look at what's happening in somebody's backyard or up the street or 30 miles away, or that's a central symbol in your national context, yeah, that's relevant for you. And that's what students should be thinking about. They shouldn't be invested in somebody else's life and somebody else's curriculum, as it were. And, one of the interesting contradictions to, let's say, cultural heritage education is that, yes, at the same time, you do want them thinking more broadly and more globally, because cultural heritage is a symbol of something, and it is something that's not just yours, but it's something that's shared, and also it's other people's. And part of living in a global context is also understanding and appreciating what they are doing. So there's a tension in localizing and globalizing concepts and themes. But I think if you're interested in promoting sustainable development, especially in the developing world, get people thinking about what's happening in their environment and helping empower them to think about and develop the tools to interact with that in a local level is very important. And of course, we want them to be global citizens, or in some cases, we want them to be global citizens, maybe not in all cases. And those people can begin to think as they get older about how these things, as they get older, but also at this current stage, how these things relate to things currently happening in the broader world. Sometimes the kids, I don't know if they always need to make that link themselves, that this is I'm a part of a global project. Some
Mm.
kids like that. Some kids like that.
Yeah, it seems like that would be really cool and then also maybe a little bit stressful. I would think, or perhaps overwhelming to think, wow, I have such an impact but I think as well, this is a great realization for some students to have too early on.
Saying all that, it is important for kids to see how things are a part of the global picture. But I think so much of cultural heritage work is localizing and saying there's so many resources and so much education that exists already that talks about the global picture, but we want to make this relevant to you and recognizing that you have a context, you have a cultural history, you have a living cultural life. And we want to integrate these themes to make this relevant for you. And not thinking about what somebody in Boston is thinking about because they live next to a different river. They have
Mm.
different people in their neighborhood
Mhm.
and they come from a very different part of the world. So a lot of this work for cultural heritage education that we are working on is still for sustainable development, and that is in a global context. But yeah, I guess it's trying to hold both worlds together at the same time.
That makes sense. Totally. Now, I know we were kind of focusing on one particular curriculum you built, but I know you've worked on developing curriculum for, really a decade at this point. But in terms of educating based on cultural heritage, are there any plans to scale this model to larger regions or communities, or perhaps any other projects you're working on with this type of educational model?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot that's happening in the region in Southern Africa, but there's also a lot happening in the world. I think there are more and more efforts globally, almost everywhere, that's trying to tie together themes of cultural heritage and education. I think, let's say, countries as a whole are interested in it because again, it's relevant for them, it's relevant for their people, but also it can build a type of national identity, a cultural identity, a shared national and cultural identity that isn't overly particularistic, meaning to say that they want to find symbols that people can latch onto for no matter where you are in your country to things of your country. It almost it can be used as a type of nationalism.
Mhm.
And I don't mean to say that with any positive or negative regard. It's just a way of building a type of cohesion amongst as a collective group. Um, so there are efforts for that all over. I think actually Saudi Arabia is a really interesting example of how, um, as far as I understand, there is an effort to build in cultural heritage education that's somewhat divorced, excuse me, from, let's say, religious heritage.
Mm.
There's a lot of emphasis right now on building relationship to Nabatean cultural sites of
Mm.
2000 years ago. And this is, in a Saudi context, it's connected to building a new type of nationalism, a new type of national identity that maybe has room for different modes of expression. Um, I don't know. I don't know if to say it's a bit more secular, but it is that as well. Um, yeah, in Southern Africa, the curriculum resources that we created, again, this is something we spent most of our time thinking about Zambia and South Africa in our work, but these are meant to be tools that can be used across 11 countries. And these are all resources that can be used as models for how to do this on a local scale and on a national scale in these other parts of the region.
Hmm.
So yeah, but really the projects are all over. There's cultural heritage projects all over Europe, all over South Asia. It's uh, it's a thing. It's a thing right
Yeah.
now.
Makes sense. Well, for pivoting now, maybe a little bit more towards a teacher resource, perhaps for someone who's looking to develop their curriculum and integrate cultural heritage into it, what I would like to know is, are there any maybe tips or recommendations you can offer for students who are trying to identify the most relevant local issues that students might be interested in or concerned about? Are there any kind of specific criteria or factors you consider when selecting topics to teach upon?
Yeah, there's different ways to go about it. Some of it is how much proximity a teacher is going to have proximity to students' lives.
Mm.
I'm not a teacher in Southern Africa, so I didn't have that type of proximity. So in order to do this work, to get those type of answers, I had to rely on slightly more roundabout ways. And things like focus groups were helpful ways of bridging that gap. But if someone's a teacher and they're trying to think about what's locally relevant, one of the best ways to do it is to well, in terms of subjects, talk to the students, ask them questions, throw out ideas with them, and maybe even co-generate some of the learning with them if you have the flexibility to do that. If in some of the cases in Southern Africa, there's not a clear way to build in intangible cultural heritage or tangible cultural heritage into the curriculum because you don't know, let's say, how to do it, spend some time thinking about it, researching, talking to school leadership and asking for resources. If school leadership doesn't have the resources for that, can think about connecting to academics at universities in the region and asking for direction about things that are locally relevant. On one hand, it's about identifying what cultural heritage resources to select, and people have different levels of literacy around that. And the other one is how to find and connect it locally in a relevant way to kids. And that is going to be through conversation with kids themselves. And hopefully there's some kind of fusion that can happen in that framework. And obviously different schools have different types of requirements. So there might be a third column that you need to cross-reference with when designing something like that.
Mm. Okay, definitely. Can you integrate heritage-based learning into traditional subjects like, let's say, math or science?
Yeah, a lot of the materials that we did are not meant to exist in their own cultural heritage subject. The materials that we put together were primarily created to show how cultural heritage can be integrated into existent disciplines to further the disciplinary goals while also furthering knowledge, literacy, and the utility of cultural heritage in those disciplines.
Mhm. Maybe just about creativity and finding ways to kind of link the lesson plan to multiple subject areas.
Yeah, one example is there's a game that we developed a curriculum around that there's a game that's used across Southern Africa. It's an indigenous game where students will kind of sit across from one another. It's very similar to Jacks in the United States and people play in the United States.
Hmm.
And we found this actually really great academic article that was already promoting the use of this game in teaching math. And because it has to do with counting and elements of addition and subtraction. So we ended up creating a sample lesson plan about how this game could be used to build numeracy skills in young kids. And that's an example. A game is a type of intangible cultural heritage. It doesn't have a physical object, but there's a cultural practice that's been inherited and passed down that's used to not just as a tool for play, but then to build different types of skills like coordination and social bonding and basic math skills. And we say, okay, like this thing already exists in your context and it's already relevant for things like, hey, gym class, or it's already relevant for things like math. Let's just blend it together in a way that allows it to exist inside of your existing math goals.
Hmm. That's fantastic. That's a great example as well. And for teachers maybe looking to build curriculum around these topics, are there any professional development channels you can recommend? Like, let's say, websites or perhaps other kind of learning opportunities for teachers so they can kind of get involved in cultural heritage education?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with where you are in the world. I
Mm.
don't know where all the listeners are. But a lot of the impetus for the work that we did in Southern Africa is based around a professional development initiative within UNESCO called Sustainability Starts with Teachers.
Mhm.
And it's how to build the capacity of educators and school leaders to build in things like 21st century skills and promote sustainable development. That's a program, that's an initiative that's trying to blend these elements together. But cultural heritage is, right, it's locally relevant, it's regionally relevant, sometimes it's nationally relevant. So finding centers of cultural heritage in your local, in your region, in your nation are great resources that can be housed in a library archive, that could be housed at a national historic site in somebody's backyard or an hour away. It can also be an approach that people take to history that's taught to different types of social sciences that are actively trying to generate conversation about its relevance, not as a historical, the things that are being discussed and learned about, not as historical objects only, but things that are still alive and relevant. And from a student-centered perspective, even figuring out what's the type of heritage, teacher can do some work on uncovering what is the heritage that students are bringing to their own classrooms, eliciting their thoughts and reflections on that so that the teacher then can figure out how to bring that in a meaningful way as a learning experience. And kids in different parts of the world are going to have different heritages that they're bringing. And so therefore the teacher in the center of the class, or actually hopefully the students in the center
Mhm.
of the class, they
Mhm.
can find creative ways of saying, okay, like now that I have a better understanding about what your heritage is, if I don't already, then I can either co-generate with you or I can generate myself some kind of learning experience where you can explore that and integrate that. Yeah, starting where the student is a great way to go.
Hmm. Perfect. That's awesome. And lastly, do you have any further advice or perhaps, anything that you'd like to mention that we didn't talk about, in terms of building a cultural heritage focused curriculum or getting students involved with local sustainability or even local, cultural elements that could kind of paint a broader picture?
Yeah, I would say thinking small is an approach that I might recommend. Similar to how a lot of the materials that we help design are not meant to exist in their own subject, their own discipline of cultural heritage, but rather we're trying to find ways to show and integrate cultural heritage into existing subject matter. That can be done by way of a single lesson plan
Mhm.
or a few lesson plans, or it can be sprinkled in across many different units. And in that sense, the burden of designing a whole new curriculum doesn't need to be there, but it can give teachers some opportunity to experiment and try it on a small scale. Again, if this is a priority for them, and I think there needs to be experimentation. And some schools and some teaching environments are more conducive to experimentation and they're more supportive of that. But finding ways to figure out where a single lesson can bridge that gap between my disciplinary goals from my department chair has laid out for me, or
Mhm.
and what cultural heritage is, I think, yeah, that's where some fertile learning and teaching can happen. Just focusing on a single lesson and experimenting.
Well, that's fantastic, Ross. I really appreciate that. And I think that our listeners are certainly going to appreciate your recommendations for them as well. Having let's say, a classroom focused on relevant information is only going to help not only students retain more information, like you said, but really take on to these 21st century skills that are going to help them for future, whether that's in career or more years to come in education.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree. with all that. And I will say also, just as a caveat, as I know not every teacher has that type of environment where they can experiment, where they can just try something new and they can try to synthesize, let's say, something like cultural heritage with the requirements that are laid out for them. So, I hope where people can, they can find room for experimentation. I just want to acknowledge that it's not always there. It's not always there for teachers.
Of course, yeah. Keeping in mind other requirements of the school district or what have you. But ultimately, if there's an opportunity to engage students more, to kind of take it where you can. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again, Ross. I appreciate your time, and I hope to have you back on the show soon.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks.